सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
I'm sure all of you will agree that we have a lot of political corruption in India. Now, what lies at the root of political corruption in India? Once again, I suspect most of you will agree that the root of the political corruption in India lies in our electoral funding. It began with the first general election in 1952. 3 generations of the wisest Indians, wisest and the most patriotic, nationalistic, sincere Indians have failed to defeat it over 65 years. I'm counting 65 up to 2017. Finally, on 1st April 2017, you thought there was a chance of countering it. On the other hand, electoral corruption in India or political corruption in India was legalized. It was fully legalized with the passing of the union budget that year. So it has remained legalized for 5 crucial years while a new national government has been elected and 24 state governments have been elected, toppled, re-elected and so on and so forth. Now, with the long frozen hearing on the challenge to the Modi government's anonymous electoral bonds inserted in the 2017-18 budget, in fact, that insertion had also amendments to many other linked laws from Representation of People Act to FCRA, Foreign Contributions Regulation Act. All of them were smuggled in through that budget. Now, this is finally listed by the Supreme Court Registry for 19 September. Now, let me also caution you, health warning, it isn't on its roster formally yet. So, fingers crossed, I hope it comes up. If this happens, India will see one last opportunity. It was in early 2019 that a high-powered 3-judge Supreme Court bench headed by Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi and including Justices Deepak Gupta and Sanjeev Khanna passed an interim order. It was regrettably so indecisive that it made it seem as if Alexander Pope had written his willing to wound and yet afraid to strike lines specifically for it. We have to weigh our words carefully, questioning the top code at any time, but especially in this case, because more than passing an interim order that would allow them to revisit the case in detail soon, it seemed more like a case of kicking the can or can of worms down the road indefinitely. That indefinitely, quote unquote, has already consumed 3.5 years and the tenure of 3 Chief Justices of India since. Chances are, by the time this hearing gathers pace, we will be in the era of the 5th. Now, we are inured to judicial delays in India, to endless judicial delays. This has provided a perennial theme for Bollywood movies. So deeply ingrained have the judicial delays and their acceptance and their stoic acceptance become in our culture that even our top judges now, top court judges, use that immortal Tarikh pe Tarikh line from Sunny Deol's Damini of 1993 when they berate some slow-moving high courts. This case, however, seemed more than just a victim of the usual delays. It looked something more complex. This looks, and I say it with the greatest humility and respect, a case of risk avoidance. It looks too messy, let's leave it for later, right? Abhi kya panga lena hai? In any case, many states had already voted in the first phase of the 2019 general elections the previous day, so why open the Pandora's box at that point? For sure, there should be transparency, the bench also said in the same interim order, and they indeed gifted us transparency. It's just that it was transparency of the sealed envelope. They said every party had to give the details of donations received through these anonymous electoral bonds to the Election Commission of India by 30th May 2019 in sealed envelopes. It was then left to the ECI to decide whether, when and how to reveal these. In effect, they tossed the ball sideways in the adjoining court. Not in the court in front of them across the net, but in the adjoining court, which was the ECI's, Election Commission of India's, which in turn sat tight on these details. Because why would they really reveal these now if the Supreme Court wasn't doing it? It would be foolhardy for mere superannuated civil servants to rush wherein these apex court judges fear to tread. Why would they get into a mess when the Supreme Court judges, who have a much higher level of immunity and respect and institutional clout, are also avoiding taking a call on this? Now, I know fear is a rude word, but I am merely using an established cliched phrase. We can put it differently, using a line from Chinese strongman Deng Xiaoping. In the 1988 summit with Rajiv Gandhi in Beijing, he made his case for putting the border dispute out of the way by arguing with typical Chinese flourish that our generation perhaps did not have the wisdom to resolve an issue as complicated as our border. Let us therefore leave it to a wiser generation in future and progress where we can. So start your trade, start other things, people to people contact, leave the border for a wiser generation. It seems more reasonable that the interim April 2019 order reflected some such thinking. The question is, has the generation of judges with that wisdom, that higher wisdom, risen now? Even when the late Arun Jaitley brought in these electoral bonds in his 2017-18 budget, he had conceded that it was only a partial reform. But he said it's a beginning. This was just the first step, he said, to take black money out of the electoral funding. That was a reasonable point, I think, as until then rich individuals, corporates, good or not quite so good, property sharks, mining barons, criminals, thugs, smugglers, just anybody could bring cash in wheelbarrows and give it to the political parties and leaders that they believed in or needed to cultivate or needed to please. Now they were able to buy bonds from State Bank of India, obviously from their tax-paid white money. They had a further incentive in keeping it in the white domain because political contributions through these bonds were tax deductible. It also enabled the political class to migrate to the same white environment because the contributions they received were tax exempt. But it was the first step towards transparency. The exclusion of the logical next step made it a remedy worse than the disease. We'll explain how. This is how it worked. A donor, usually a corporate, would go to State Bank of India, that's the only bank you could go to for these bonds, would go to State Bank of India and buy the electoral equivalent of bearer check or bond. These could just be given away to the party of their choice, which in turn would deposit it into a designated bank account. The donor doesn't need to tell anybody who the bonds are being given to. I told you they are like bearer checks. They don't bear the name of the person they are meant to be given to. The recipient at the same time doesn't need to disclose where they've got it from. So while the first step brought electoral funding from black into white money, the second brought in the cloak of secrecy or anonymity. It was still like money being passed between interested parties in total darkness without the voter knowing who paid whom and how much, or the citizen and any of the institutions, including us journalists, knowing if any decision could have been influenced by such payments. An anonymous contribution would still draw by default the suspicion of being a bribe. I'm sorry to say that. It was now worse than before, in fact. Fully legalized electoral corruption. I don't say it lightly. I'm not ranting. So let's explore it further. I'm trying to be as clinical as possible to the best of my ability and my knowledge. The voter and the citizen did not know who was paying whom or whether any decisions came as a result of this. Who knows, for example, why massive tariff raises were suddenly handed out to one specific sector, say steel, when we had no way of ruling out a cartelized industry making a sizable purchase of the same electoral bonds and putting them in a certain party's box. I'm not saying it happened, but that suspicion cannot be ruled out because we don't know. And secrecy breeds suspicion, and secrecy about a democratic practice which should be fully open breeds further suspicion. Further, while no one outside knew anything, the system knew it all. After all, a PSU bank, that is State Bank of India, knew exactly who has bought or which political party has deposited how much. The rest needs a simple matching of bond numbers and you will know who's given how much money to whom. Determining who's a friend and who the foe is now couldn't be simpler than this for those owning the system. The government of the day would therefore know not only who to reward but who to send people in green shades to or who to punish if they so wished. Now you understand why we say the 65-year battle against electoral corruption was lost on 1st April 2017 and why the new electoral bonds, instead of cleaning up the system, legalized corruption. Given what our expectations from the political class are, they are low obviously, nobody believed the BJP government will keep its promise of further reforms. The real disappointment was the too hot, leave it to a wiser generation response from the Supreme Court of India. It's been 5 years since the bonds came in. India's system of electoral funding is now more distorted than even in the era before this cynical so-called reform. Which brings us to our final question. Can India count on its most respected institution, namely the judiciary, to bring clarity and also redeem itself in the process?